Good morning, everyone. Yeah, very great to see the turnout here. Alan Carey, who I'll introduce, had a great session this morning with our faculty as well. He is the director of the Sphere Education Initiatives at the Cato Institute. The Sphere Education Initiatives works with grades 5 through 12 educators and administrators to provide them with the knowledge, experience, resources, and professional development opportunities to bring difficult conversations on the most pressing issues to the classroom and equip our country's students to engage in civil dialogue. By bringing facts and reason to the conversation and through emphasizing viewpoint diversity, Sphere works to rekindle the foundation of civic culture in America. And so we started with a great session this morning with all of the middle and upper school teachers talking about things that are really in Walker's wheelhouse, which is how do we get, help our students engage in a world around them, engage with difficult issues in reasonable, thoughtful ways. So we're looking forward to Alan talking a bit with you guys as parents as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alan.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning. How are you guys doing today? Good? How many of you guys stopped by for the breakfast ahead of time? A decent number? Was it good? I didn't. I stopped at Taco Bell this morning because the hotel breakfast was real bad. It's not something worth consuming. And that Taco Bell, by comparison, being better gives you a good idea. Well, thanks so much for coming out this morning. What I wanted to try and do this morning is talk just a little bit, one, about what we talked about this morning with the faculty, talk about civil discourse more broadly, why it's important, why it matters, and some of the unique things that go into helping create a really healthy and thriving school culture that engages in challenging conversations. Why and how, and dig into that. But what I'd love to do is keep most of this conversational. Bring your perspectives and questions to the table, things that you're thinking about and concerned about, and use that as the backbone for our conversation today. So with that in mind, let me tell you just a little bit about what we talked about this morning. So in bringing the faculty together, part of what we wanted to try and do was dig deeper into the idea of civil discourse. So when you think about that idea of civil discourse, what comes to mind for you, right? What are sort of the ideas that bounce around in your head when you hear, this is what we mean by civil discourse, and this is why we might want to talk about it at the Walker School. Also, I don't know if they told you, but this is a participatory session in the morning.
I think about conversations, debate.
I'm sorry, a little bit louder?
Just conversations, debate, discussions.
Listening.
Good. Yeah, some listening, some conversation. What else?
Like a healthy disagreement.
Different perspectives.
Yeah.
Listening to different perspectives.
Good. So when we think about civil discourse, some of the things that we keep in mind is that at its core, it's what you might say is the most foundational part of a democratic society. And what I mean by that is, in a society where people are free to engage in different ways of living, different things that they care about, choosing different paths, different schools, different religions, whatever might happen to be, civil discourse is the mechanism by which we all talk and engage and grow and get along. At its core, civil discourse really includes about two big ideas. One, it's about sharing your perspective, and two, listening to the perspective of someone else. So it's not about argument, it's not necessarily about debate, but it's often grounded in disagreement. It's often about learning, right? So what are some of those core features that go into what makes civil discourse important? Well, one, you have to begin with an understanding of saying, here's my perspective, and tie it to something, an opinion, an argument, some facts, whatever it might happen to be, and say, when it comes to this issue, here's where I am. Two, it needs to be grounded in understanding of listening and conversation. How do we bring to the table what we're learning from others, right? So listen to understand, not listen to wait your turn to talk. Right, so I live just outside of Washington, D.C., and I assure you, next to no one in that city spends any time listening to understand. Not what they do. If you watched the State of the Union last night, you saw a lot of that happening. Booing and hissing and name-calling. It was a terrible experience. I hope you did something else with your time other than watch that. There was nothing else to watch on my hotel room last night, so that's what I watched instead. So why does civil discourse matter? What do you guys think? Please.
It matters because if you're only looking through your lens and you only understand your lens or your perspective, then you can't sympathize or understand someone else's.
Good. Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical. Did you guys all hear that? Good. Why else? What are some of the other reasons that civil discourse matters?
What's the alternative?
What's that?
The alternatives are to be considered.
Yeah.
It's not civil, it's what?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the right question to be asking, right? So think about, in a society like ours, you can either get along in one of two ways. One is by civil discourse, the democratic process, voting and listening and making decisions and engaging with each other and coming to a conclusion, right? The peaceable means of disagreement, right? Because we do all sorts of things that have really challenging and difficult points of view on them. But the other way is through force, right? It's through coercion and violence. That's the only two ways that you can get along in society. And if you have a society that's not committed to civil discourse, inevitably, it slides to a society committed to using violence as a mechanism of getting its way. My group is stronger than your group. We're going to force our way on you. And for most of human history, that's actually how we made decisions. But that's a really terrible way of making decisions, right? One, because inevitably, some other group's going to come along that's bigger and stronger and more powerful than you. But two, because it doesn't help us get better. It doesn't help us learn or grow or gain from the perspectives that other people have. The organization that I run is called the Sphere Education Initiatives. Our work is committed to the idea of saying, how do we overcome polarization and tribalism in society? Right? So if you think about polarization and tribalism, so much of what we see today in cable news, State of the Union address, in the way that things happen, it's polarizing. What do I mean by that? There's academic literature talks about this as the idea of affective polarization. Any of you familiar with that term? A little bit niche. But the idea of affective polarization is that we take on the aspects of our group. And whatever our group happens to be, that's good and right and just. And whatever the other group happens to say or do or think is bad, it is wrong, it is immoral, it is evil. So what do you do to evil? You fight evil, right? Affective polarization creates a kind of culture in society that says, you're the bad guy, we're the good guys. Therefore, any means are justified in bringing about your demise and our victory. That's a really dangerous mechanism. So what we try and do is work with educators, teachers, administrators, principals, parents on the question of how do we help build, once again, a culture grounded in the idea of civil discourse, of free speech, of commitment to those principles that enable peaceful, prosperous societies to work, right? Because the alternative is dangerous. So much of the name-calling, the bullying, the condescension, the anger and nastiness that has taken up, particularly on the national level, is directly contrary to achieving a society we're excited about. So that's what we're talking about, right? Is how do we work with educators and parents to help students grow up with a point of view that says, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. I'm curious about why you think that. I want to know where you come from. Not because we don't think the things that they believe or the things that they come to the table with are wrong or incorrect, right? The goal here isn't to convert people to a particular point of view, but to an orientation toward others. We think about ideas like diversity, inclusion, belonging. How do you bring that about in a school community? Part of the way that you do it is by equipping students to value those things. And to do it from a ground point of viewpoint diversity, of civil discourse, of engaging others who are different and respecting them in their differences. So that's where we started. We talked a lot about that. We engaged in those kinds of conversations. Some of you have been able to pick up a document that we brought some copies with. This is a one that my team put together just recently. I'm very excited to take a look at it. I didn't quite have enough copies for everyone, so if you guys want more, please pass it along to the leadership here at the school, and I'll send some copies down for everyone. But it's also available freely to download on our website. It's actually more interactive that way, so you may prefer that version with the links that you can click through. They still haven't figured out a way to turn paper into hyperlinks, but hopefully we'll figure that out someday. But the other thing that we spent some time thinking about this morning is then, what makes this hard to do? And by this I mean, have challenging conversations, whether that's in the classroom or in the community. What makes it hard to bring about real, meaningful civil conversations? So we talked about a lot of different things, but I'd love to hear from all of you. As you're thinking about your work as a parent, or the conversations you've been having with your student, or the things that you've engaged in your communities beyond the school, what are some of the challenges that you run into when it comes to thinking about how do I practice civil discourse in what I do, and where do I see that not going well in those other interactions that I have? So what have you run into?
Well, I think for me, there are two critical principles that have affected me personally and I've observed. One is fear. Fear of the other person's perspective, fear of the unknown. The other that I've encountered and I think is quite prevalent is just, and I'm trying to find the right words, particularly in this environment, but let me drop that one.
Yeah. We'll come back to the other one.
Yes.
But I'm also very comfortable with, what's a way of putting this? When I tell my son all the time, my son is 10 going on 11, he's a very precocious 5th grader, stumble through it. I'd rather you work it out and understand that I'm going to be understanding in how you're stumbling through getting those ideas right. So I want to encourage you all that same general mentality. It's okay to be messy and thinking about talking about hard things. That's in fact good, right? Because it means we're struggling with something and it gives us a chance to get better.
So I'll mention it.
Yeah.
I think the generational philosophies that we learn in our homes, in our communities, that may be very different than our ability to really, as you put it, have an orientation toward others, right? Limits us to really begin to have those conversations and see a different perspective. So that's my second one.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I want to start with the first one you said, because I think that one is really critical. It is a very normal human response to situations that are new or different or scary to be fearful, including being fearful of others, fearful of things that are different, and fearful of change. We just have to begin with that baseline. That's normal. Right? It's a perfectly healthy response to situations around you. But the question for all of us is, how do we overcome that? And thankfully, that's the point of education, right? And you're all incredibly blessed to be at a school like Walker that has built into its DNA that understanding of education's purpose as a kind of growth, as a kind of willingness to engage ideas and challenging things, and look at them as not something to be afraid of, but as something that can help us be better, something that we can learn from. The older I get, the more I am consistently reminded of how dumb I am. And what I mean by that, in a joking sense, is there's so much I don't know and can't know about the world, about others, about all sorts of situations and challenges, right? And what I love about getting outside of Washington, D.C. is a very healthy reminder that there's so much else that's going on that's much more important than what happens with those crackpots. I'm surrounded by them every day. But the question then becomes, how do I not be fearful? And for all of you, most importantly, how do I help my child not be afraid of that which is different? Lots that you can do there. I know there's so much that the team here at Walker is doing to help answer that question. But let's think about your role in particular as parents, as the individuals who have the greatest shaping influence on your children's life. The first thing that you can do is model behavior. More than what you say, more than what you ever would write, your children learn from what you do. So if the question is, how do I help them not be afraid? Don't be afraid. Right? Engage in those conversations. If you happen to, for example, typically watch one news program with a particular ideological viewpoint, spend some time with them watching a different one. It's going to be messy at first and painful, but it gets to be good. One of the best gentlemen I've ever had the pleasure of working with is a guy by the name of Julian Roxon. He's a history teacher and director of diversity at the Windsor School in Boston. Fantastic gentleman. But Julian, more than anyone else I have ever known, is brilliant when it comes to this as a personal practice. He is a very progressive gentleman by politics and orientation at a very progressive school, in a very progressive city, in a very progressive state. Julian knows that to be true. So what does he do? He spends a lot of time listening to AM radio conservative talk shows. He goes out of his way to go to events and debates in scenarios where he's putting himself in direct contact with alternate perspectives on the world. My favorite thing that Julian does, every year he matches his class, it's an all-girls school that he teaches at, up with a class in rural Montana for Zoom conversations on a regular basis to talk about their different orientations and experiences in life. Because Julian recognizes that what's the best way for me to model a better way of engaging differences of opinion and perspective? To live it. That's the first thing that you can do. The second thing that you can do, and I want to encourage you to think about, is talk about it. Talk about hard things. Again, that same basic idea. Your children will model what you do. The way you think and the way you talk. What do you talk about at home? What do you talk about at the dinner table? What do you talk about after church on Sunday? That, right? Fill those moments, not all the time. That gets to be painful. Nobody wants that. Sometimes you just want to talk about sports or the weather, or frankly, want them to be quiet. Some days I just wish there would be quiet. Doesn't happen with a 10-year-old. But what do you talk about with them? How do you normalize talking about challenging things in different perspectives? When Russia invaded Ukraine last year, did you guys talk about it? When things come up in the news about police shootings or brutality, do you talk about it? When it comes up about elections, who's running for office and different points of view and where you agree or where you disagree, do you talk about it? Make that be a part of the way that you engage them and show them how to engage those ideas. And you'll get all of the kinds of solutions to the things that you're worried about. Maybe they won't always come to the conclusions you want them to. That's the darned thing about children, is that they eventually have their own mind and go in a direction you don't want them to. But you're going to get them there in their orientation toward others much more quickly than you ever thought. All right, I've been talking way too much. Let me pause. We've got a rough idea about civil discourse and why it's important and how to start to build some of that. What are some of the interesting questions or challenges that you all have in doing that? So what are the things that you would like to talk about?
How do you make children feel comfortable in the classroom talking about some of these issues if they think their issues are different than the majority of the classroom? Because in some level of conversation, you have to have trust, but when you're new in a room and there's a teacher you had never met before, there's no trust there. How do you feel comfortable talking about views openly, any of the kids really?
Yeah, well, one thing that is unique about your circumstances is that you've all chosen for your students to go here, right? And that's great, because there's something about the Walker School that you were excited about, something that you said, this is the best place for my son or daughter to be here. So start with that premise and saying there's something that you trust about where the school is. But then what do you do from there? I feel confident it's the case that all of the faculty and staff here at the school want to talk to you. Interested in your perspective. They want to know about your kid. They want to know about your thoughts and concerns. And they love to share with you how they approach the classroom. Right. Now, you're not going to know 100% that every teacher is going to get it right every time they have those kinds of hard conversations. They probably won't. And none of us will, right? But I can assure you from what I've seen from this group today, they're going to get it right a lot more often than the vast majority of other schools that I've worked with. So you've got a lot to be proud of that you can work with here. But I think that's the key, right? One, walk into the classroom with curiosity, right? Or those phone calls or whatever it might happen to be with the teacher and say, help me understand how you approach these things. What's your general approach to challenging conversations, to difficult things coming up in the classroom? And then when you happen to hear about something like maybe your child represents a conversation that happened over the course of the day, if your child is anything like mine or the ones that I've worked with, it isn't always a factful and clear representation of the reality of what happened. Start with the premise of saying you love your child and you're curious to learn about why their experience where it was. Then engage in that conversation with the teacher or the administrator of the school. Say, here's what I heard. I'd love to learn more about what happened. But genuinely walk into it with an open mind. The most dangerous thing that we can do is walk in with the presumption that something nefarious was happening. Because as soon as we do that, we put ourselves in a position to be on the defensive and not listen, instead attack. Why? Because we love our children, right? We only want what's right for them. But they do too. And I think that's some of how you get there, right? You can build that trust with a teacher, you can build it with a school, and you can start with that baseline knowing that this school is in a really great spot with some of those approaches and questions. That's a very good question. What else? What other questions do you guys have? Or other things that you're thinking about?
Outside of school, knowing sort of when to speak up and say I have a different thought, when it's best to just maybe.
Yeah, can you share a little more context about what you mean?
I guess when someone says something that you disagree with or that you really have an opinion that's just disagree with, and when it's appropriate to say let's, and when it's appropriate to just.
Yeah. My general inclination is that nearly all of us, nearly all the time, hold back too much. So I would say more often than you think, try and talk about it. Except for the very rare number of us who are way too willing to engage in that, and we need to step back. But your default should be, one, think about the circumstance that you're in. Is this a relevant conversation for the kind of group that you're interested in being in, right? If you find it that it's some like wildly irrelevant conversation to the moment, let it go. But if this is someone you're going to spend time around, again, more often, or I think perhaps more importantly, if you find what they're saying to be dangerous or hateful, then engage, right? Choose to engage in those moments, again, because others are watching. Whether that's your children or the other people in the group or whoever it might happen to be. Say, choose to engage. Then how you engage, I think, needs to be grounded in the relevance of the specific situation and circumstance you find yourself in. My first recommendation is to begin with question asking. In the document in there, we lay out a framework called AWARE, which is a helpful one of thinking about it, but one of the ideas in it is the W stands for wonder, right? It's an orientation toward thinking about those kinds of situations grounded in curiosity. Who am I talking to? Where are they coming from? What are the experiences they bring to the table? Why might they be saying that? Then use that wonder to ground your questions in the first place. One of the most powerful things you can say is, interesting, tell me more about why you think that. Right? Because you're not putting them immediately on the defensive. Now there's times when you should be putting them on the defensive, right? If they're saying something crass or hurtful or harmful, right? The goal should be getting them to stop first before engaging in conversation. But if what they're saying is something that's like, you happen to come down on the question of, let's say, immigration on this side, and I might happen to be over here, something that we meaningfully and significantly disagree about, but not something that is hateful or harmful, but just a disagreement on how we're thinking about it. Start with curiosity. Ground yourself in an attempt to learn why they think what they do. It's easy for us to accidentally begin with assumptions about other people and where they're coming from and why they believe what they do. And it's very easy to accidentally assign to them in our heads points of view that they don't hold. Right? Curiosity first. One. Then from there, share your opinion. Engage in it in a way that says, here's where I'm thinking, here's where I come from, in a different point of view and how to get there. Here's why I think it's important. All the while listening and speaking with the goal of learning and understanding, but not convincing. Right? We should intentionally separate out rhetoric and persuasion from civil discourse. Those things matter and they have a place in society. When we're thinking about first engaging with others with a different point of view, it's not to get them to come to your point of view. Because in doing that, most often what you do is either stifle them, and they'll just harden in the position that they have, or they won't engage. They'll just move away from you, either theoretically or quite literally in physical proximity. Does that help?
So more.
There's three things that I just keep thinking about just as we're engaging, and it's one, the vulnerability to be in this space, to be open to share, to go on this pathway, to listen, to share perspective. Then I think that there's also a safety piece that I think about. I think particularly for my son, when I model this in relationships that go away from what we are norm or what we believe, to kind of model this space of find where there's a commonality, right? Do we live in the same neighborhood? Do we go to the same worship place? Do we happen to go to the same, restaurant? That there still is this space for him that I think he struggles with his safety. Mm-hmm. And will the world invite him as a Black young male to be here? And then I come to, there's a risk. There's a risk that I can, when I thought of, you're asking like, when do I talk, when do I kind of, hold back? There's a risk that we can have this engagement and that the other person may not be ready to receive it. Mm-hmm. And so where do we leave space to return to it, that maybe after they've had a chance to kind of process and think like, oh wait, you really did want to hear my perspective. How do you handle all of that? But those were my three things that I kept thinking
most
about.
of the time not well, right? I mean, that's the candid part about all of this, is that even those of us who do this kind of thing for a living, we fail at it all the time, right? But the goal is do it, think about it, learn, get better. I'm going to touch a little bit on the second point that you brought up, is this question of safety, right? How do we put our children as they're growing and learning in a scenario where we expose them to risk but in a healthy way? Because we know that that movement from childhood to adulthood requires ultimately resilience, that they be comfortable and capable of doing this on their own. It would be a terrible scenario if they got to a point where they went to college, they went into their careers and couldn't engage in situations where people had different points of view, different approaches in getting into things, and sometimes are going to be rude and harsh and difficult, right? I was just in Philadelphia at the end of last year, and that's sort of the way of living. No offense to any Philadelphians in the room. Very short sidebar. I had a very good friend in grad school who was from Philadelphia originally, and so the first time I went to town and visited for a conference where I was presenting a paper, I was just shocked by the general interaction of people in the city. And he was joking like, oh yeah, well you didn't see this because you flew out of town, but there's actually a sign on the highway leaving town that says, leaving Philadelphia will get you next time. And that really cracked me up at the time. So I don't mean to be overly harsh on them. I'm rooting for the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. But the question then becomes, how do we help our kids get there? Right? I think about it in a similar way to we think about how do we get them comfortable with physical risks. And what do I mean by that? Right? Well, one, When do they get to a spot where we're comfortable letting them walk to a friend's house, riding their bike around the neighborhood? Each of those next steps, right? Getting further and further and further away until they have that independence. Right? The same thing is true in thinking about preparing them for the kind of intellectual risks that come along with conversations and growth and mental engagement. One is knowing that they have to be aware of where things are unsafe. But they also need to be comfortable knowing that they play a role in making those situations go right. They can choose to engage, they can take it to a certain point, but they are going to be at times harmed and aggrieved and insulted. Right? They probably are already among the friend group, they're comfortable with that. But with others that they don't know, and disrespected. So how do we get them comfortable with that? You introduce them to those scenarios. Right? You give them the flexibility to do it, but then, and I think particularly importantly, on the back end of it, you help them process the experience. What was it like? How did it feel when you were insulted? What are things that you do that accidentally put other people into that same situation yourself? When are you being rude and you don't realize it? Right? We can't ever solve for how others come to the world. We can only control for how we bring ourselves to it. Right? So knowing that and getting comfortable with what you can do really takes them a long way. What else have you all done?
I really would like to build on the question that was just asked. And for me, I feel like there's a bit of cognitive dissonance between, and maybe this is another conversation, so you can reel me in, but between the civil discourse discussion and what you just said as a solution relative to when you talk about safety and physical safety. How do you prepare someone who's perhaps, from a societal perspective, more at risk for safety to say it's okay to bridge that and to continue to take incremental risks when the propensity for them to be in unsafe situations are high? And so I'm talking about, as a Black young male, the concern that she is issuing. And again, this might be another conversation, but I think they are connected, right? So do you have any thoughts on that?
I have some really limited perspective that I can share and a couple of things that can help that go right, but I want to make sure not to stray too far away from where I can say something thoughtfully and confidently. And I'd invite all of your perspective as well on how you've dealt with similar situations. Because I think each of you have a kind of personal experience that is going to be more valuable than what I can offer authoritatively. I'll say a couple of things. One is that organizations like mine and many others are actively working to help solve some of the underlying conditions that create that kind of systemic challenge. I don't work on those things, but when it comes to criminal justice reform or reforms to the way in which individuals engage with public safety officers in society and how we help that go right, there's a lot of really good things happening in that space. And there's some terrible tragedies that have unfortunately become too common. So there's that, right? There's the background conditions happening in the world. Ultimately, what we need to do as a society is work to solve for those. But the other thing that I will say is that it is important that we help our children have a clear-eyed perspective on the reality in front of them. And with that reality, be confident in their experience in that reality. Right? Fearfulness, while warranted, is also damaging because it holds us back from being able to engage in challenging situations, intellectually or physically. Now, we shouldn't be short-sighted in our acknowledgement of those risks. We need to acknowledge that many times the danger is much higher and our response should be different, particularly for individuals in given circumstances. But that's not a terribly helpful set of things to say, right? I acknowledge I don't have a lot more to offer to that, but let me open it up to all of you. How have you responded in similar situations? What have you found to be helpful? Or conversely, what things should people avoid?
I think avoiding, one of the things that's hard is people who are so founded in their beliefs, but they don't know why, and it's only because their parents did it, or their friend group did it, or their news source says it. Sorry, just people who are grounded in their beliefs, but they don't know why. But they're so adamant that this is the right way, whether it's a political issue or racism or anti-Semitism. They that's all they know, and they don't know why they believe that. And some people just are, frankly, unwilling to think about it, and probably it's because they can't express why they believe that.
I think it's useful to think about. It was something that surprised me a lot. It was a very distinct memory in college. One of my fraternity brothers introduced me to what is now my wife. They were both theater majors. He was a black man from Cleveland. She was a white girl from Akron. Very good friends, hung out all the time, and introduced me. They would often drive around our small town, sort of not quite rural Ohio, but not far away from being rural Ohio. Like you threw a rock and you hit a cornfield, but you still had to walk to get there. And one of the most shocking things for me was being in the car when she'd get pulled over driving while he was in the car. Not for doing anything, but because there was a black man in the car and the police wanted to make sure she was okay. It happened 6 times over the course of our freshman year. And that's a kind of reality that I never had to live growing up. But it's a kind of experience that many other people do, but shouldn't have to live. So I think it's very important to acknowledge for those of us who don't have that perspective, haven't lived that scenario, to be open to the reality that there's a lot about life that is very different for other people that wasn't your own experience. I think if we begin with that, that can be enlightening and some of the unique challenges that other people face. What are you thinking?
And I think that goes back to race. And the reason I say that, and I said about listening to others' perspective, is because when someone shares their experience and the undergird of that, typically if there are different cultures or different perspectives, maybe that race. But as soon as race, the term race, is utilized, it's like all out war, right? And so how do you, and I'm finding myself, my husband and I are finding ourselves having this conversation more and more with our 13-year-old boy about why the response is the way it is. We were in Mississippi at a basketball game, Pearl, Mississippi. This young lady dropped her phone. My son picked it up and gave it to her. She held it like this. Now it crushed him. But then he comes back to me and say, why did she do that? Why? So it's like, I said, we'll talk about it on the way back to Georgia. I'm trying to buy myself some time. Because we just had a basketball game, supporting his cousins. But that's the first thing he wanted to talk about the next morning as we got on 55 coming back. And it's like, how do you say, okay, maybe her perspective was different. He's like, what is her perspective? I'm just handing her her phone. So I kept finding myself trying to navigate a difficult situation without saying, maybe it was because you were Black and she didn't welcome, you know, you showing courtesy to her, is what I said.
I
And
know
he
it's,
said-
I appreciate what you're trying to do in the sense of helping them consider what else might have been going on. But I think in that situation, at least as you've shared it, it's really unavoidable, right? It seems likely that what happened in this case is that that girl didn't like you because of who you are. And that's unjust and it's wrong, but it's real, right? And there are other examples of that that extend beyond race, but right now, that's the one that I think is probably most pertinent as a society, right? It is one of the most contrasting, polarizing, difficult things that have come up. And there are large swaths of the country who haven't dealt with it well. Sure, there are many ways in which things are a lot better today than they were decades ago, which is great. But it's utterly insufficient to say or think that we're anywhere close to being in a position where that's not an issue any longer. It really is. And it's bad, and it sucks. And I think having candid conversations with our children about that is important. Now, it's important that they think about things beyond just that construct. And it sounds like you're having those conversations with them already. But I think it's important to say and be okay with the fact that sometimes that's just going to be what it is. Like, that's the problem that we ran into in that situation. Let's talk about that and process how you're feeling about it. And talk about how we move beyond it. And to encourage the people that we're with to try and move beyond that sort of embedded racism in their approach. But it's a really lousy situation, and there's no two ways around it, and it doesn't help not to talk about it with our kids. But what else have you all done? I mean, thinking about your experiences where you've run into similar situations, where your kids in particular have run into those situations, how have you helped them talk about and process those situations?
So I just wanted to mention, my daughter was in middle school at the time, and we lived in Johns Creek. And she had heard about this book called The Hate You Give, which is now a movie.
What was the book? I'm sorry.
The Hate You Give.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with it. We were coming from church on Sunday. Again, she was in 8th grade. And I got pulled over by the police. And it alarmed me that she started to have an anxiety attack. And as the police came up, she took the position, held her hand up, and was coaching me through the process. And I said, it's okay, sweetheart, I wasn't doing anything wrong, let's just find out what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I didn't pull over in a lit public area. I pulled up under a covered area, and she was even more concerned. And I remember as she was coaching me through it, saying to her, it's gonna be okay. Long story short, my tags were expired one day. It was the weekend. It was the weekend. One day, I couldn't have done it on the weekend, and I was scheduled to do it on the Monday. I got a ticket, and I left. And I felt more concern for her than I did for myself. Because I processed what are our children internalizing and preparing for in that moment. But what I did over the next several years that I'm still doing today is to remind her that for every isolated situation, there are situations of justice and love, and I give her examples. I also remind her that yes, there are going to be situations like this, but how you respond is also going to temper that moment. And it's very difficult because you can be in the moment and emotionally absorbed in it. But I think the more, to your point, the more that you acknowledge these are realities, but consistently sow seeds of here are some alternatives to strengthen you is so important. You know, so I appreciate you engaging us on that level as well, because it's the trauma that continues to travel with you through every other experience.
Well, to my friend here, I have to disagree with you.
Okay.
And the reason is because I'm at a point in my life where I am tired of being more resilient to deal with BS, if that makes sense. It is what it is, and we're wasting our time trying to pretend it's not. The civil discourse is, if that's an opportunity for discussion, for mutual understanding and growing from it, or not. That was not. And in this situation, I came here for a reason of just being informed of what's going on, and I see a direction that we're going in, and we all kind of had a nonverbal when we understood what you meant on your drive back. We understood that. We've been there. You're not alone. But there's something you said that I was surprised about.
Yeah.
And I've been reflecting on it this whole time. I've been going through the brochure and trying to figure this out, and I'm like, okay, I see where this may be going, and I like it. Because you're exactly right when you began here. We all chose to bring our children here for a reason. We were all very intentional about it because something felt right here for our child. It was deliberate. And I don't think any one of us disagree with it, and the fact that we're all in this room here is a testimony to that. We're trying to ensure and give our teachers and our students here the ability to dialogue with disagreement, to learn and understand. But there was something you said, and I'm like, gosh, I thought that was a component of it, and I had to separate it. This is not for rhetoric and persuasion. And I didn't realize that. I was always conflating the discourse with the rhetoric and persuasion. And maybe this, in the classroom setting, I don't know if in the classroom setting, if the model should be part one and none of part two, or both. And I've been wrestling with that, and I'm trying to figure that out because, you know, we kind of, some of these topics have been on the racial side. Let's just be blunt with it. And just recently, I'm wrestling with, where do I put the registration in my son's car so that he can get to it without being provoking? It's simple things like that. And that perspective. And then you said you had I hear words and I'm like, well, what kind of person am I dealing with here? I'm always sizing people up to understand, do we even have the ability to go further in discussion? Because if we're already fundamentally apart on some things, it's not worth the discourse. It's not worth the calories. I go to my corner, you go to my corner, and we'll just make believe that, you know, we're friends when we see each other down the hallway. But it's real.
Yeah.
It is real because we're all in here talking in code. We're talking professionally. We're talking in a certain way. But there's a yearning here for all of us in here trying to figure out how we walk out of here better for our sake and our children's sake. And that's all we want. That's all we want. So when I said I disagree with you, I know where you're coming from because for my black son, I have to make sure that I protect him better than other folks do it. But there are times where I get tired of it. Why do I have to have him be the bigger person in situations where he wasn't treated fairly? Why do I have to make sure that his registration card is somewhere on this card where, God, you can't get that glove box open the same way as usual. How do you get to? And I'm at nighttime thinking about these things. And it's just a simple example. There's so many. You know where I'm going with this. There's so many that we keep thinking about. But on the racial aspect, on the gender aspect, on the religion aspect, there's so much. And I appreciate all of you all being here. Yeah. I just wish this was full.
Me too.
I really do. I just wish this was full. When I came into breakfast, I saw 2 or 3 people, and I was like, oh my gosh. You have an opportunity to come here and 1, meet among family and friends. 2, work on a solution for something that is absolutely needed right now. I mean, what I saw last night was ridiculous. my children saw what happened last night, and I'm sure they're probably watching YouTube and Snapchats or whatever they're looking at right now. They're seeing all these little snippets, and we've gotten no better for it. So, but part one, part two. Where does part two come in?
So I
Go ahead.
Right?
Yes, please.
You know, I love you, right? I remember that I have so many intersectionalities, right? I'm a black woman, I'm an immigrant. I have faced a gamut of it. So when you talk about resilience and exhaustion, I can relate firsthand, right? However, I do think that as humans, if we are to lean into this opportunity, there's a degree of resilience that you're going to have to commit to exerting. I mean, that's just the reality, right? The other thing that I would say is, I too wish that this room was full, but we only have so much control over our sphere of influence. So why not optimize and leverage this opportunity of who's in the room and say, this is just the start, right? Everybody got to eat. Why don't we decide when we leave this, who can we connect with and continue the conversation? Because the folks that are in here are showing their commitment. Now, sometimes all you got to start with is one person. And maybe I'm a little utopian, but I feel sometimes that's the influence you have with that one person, and it can percolate. So we got to do this, man.
So I hear that you say that you're tired of being resilient, and I understand that. And I can't say that I have any experience being a black man in America, nor does my son, but he has been bullied. And I've had to teach him resilience. And one of the reasons we brought him to Walker was to get away from some of that bullying. And oddly enough, he got more of it here in the first couple of years. And so we had to teach him that. Other than resilience, what do we have? And I know that resilience for, especially the black culture over years has got to have been a far greater need in the 20s and less so in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and we can't change this overnight. But with resilience in these conversations, these dialogues, it's going to continue to be a slow progression. So I'm coming from a point of ignorance. What else can be done other than dragging a couple of friends here with us to fill this stadium up, or this auditorium?
I think it's important to understand that we are people first. To just kind of go up. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. What you were saying, in understanding world views, understanding that no one's struggle is higher or lower than the next person's. That we are not just defined by what we look like and how we were born. And understanding that everyone has experiences. Everyone has hardships. Everybody has struggles. And to try to weigh that from your own perspective, I don't think is productive. But I do think, to your point, as far as having civil discourse and discussing it, there are some things that you're just, to your point as well, not going to agree with. And maybe taking a bit of emotion out of it and replacing that with a bit more logic, and just understand that we all have our thing. We all are faced with different things, and just like being in a world as who you are, you have that perspective. You don't have the other perspective, regardless of where you come from, what you look like, how much money you have, what you believe, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we start there and understand that we're all people, we all are here, there's nothing holding us back from, especially in America, from doing what we want to do, we'll understand that we have a lot more in common than we don't.
So we're running a little tight on time. I know many of you have things.
It's just getting good.
I know, right?
I want to build off of that point and use that as a mechanism to sort of wrap up for this morning. You hit on 3 or 4 themes that I think really tied us all together. But talked about earlier this idea of we either solve things through force or through deliberation and agreement, right? What's beautiful about the American system is that we found a way, however imperfectly, to get along without all agreeing. We've got a system that enables us to debate and argue and try and persuade and try and convince others and come to a decision and then peaceably move forward. But that requires that each of us, and allows that each of us, can choose to live lives differently than others. Different approaches, different things we care about, different things that matter to us that allow us to do that. That's weird, right? If you look back in world history, you look back at the way in which people have lived for centuries and millennia, this doesn't happen. It's a relatively modern invention in political governance. That's amazing. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the whole system, that we can get along without having to agree on everything. That our diversity is our strength. But to do that, a few things have to be true. Has to be true that we abide by decisions once they're made, even if we don't like them. That we have the opportunity to contest them differently when it comes to elections or policy or whatever it might happen to be. That we be free to choose to engage or not engage with people. And it has to be true that we hold the underlying condition that I view you as a human being, you view me as a human being, and there are things that follow from that. A respect for the dignity and rights of the other. Right? And that's so critically important. So when it comes to thinking about where do we go from here? How do we make the terrible parts about the reality that we live in better for our kids? The beautiful thing is that we can. We live in a situation and in a world where we can do things like this. We can have conversations like this. We can bring people together across differences and engage in them. Maybe we don't walk away with the same point of view, but that's okay. What we do is we slowly change the culture of the community and the situation that we find ourselves in. And it's important that we always be able to step out of the moment that we're living in and take a longer view of where we are. Because as you put it out, we're all going through something, as individuals and as groups of people. And it's changing, and some of it's good and some of it's terrible. But we can make it better. And as long as we commit to the things that enable the system to operate where we can make it better, there's hope. Not that we'll ever get to a solution. We won't. We're human beings after all. But we can get better. That's what we're trying to do, and that's what we're trying to help our children do. To grow up to be the kind of people who continue to help make it better. With that, I'm going to stick around for a bit. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to meet all of you. If there's anything I can do to answer questions or anything else that you'd love to talk more about, please let me know. But thank you all so much for the time. Pleasure.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Alan. Yeah, I mean, our you know, this is, we view it as a continued partnership, and you know, we've already had discussions, you know, Rick Holyfield and I have had some discussions with Alan about ways that we can continue, also ways that we continue to support our teachers through some of the professional development that they have of learning techniques of how to bring these types of things into the classroom. Because I think I appreciate all of you being here. It's clear this is a really important part of what we want to teach our kids, exactly of what Alan said of like, what is this all about? This is about helping our students be people who will go off into the world and continue to make every community that they're a part of a little bit better. And so yeah, this is ongoing work.